Hello and welcome back to my series on how to program in C#. So this is episode 2 and we're going to be looking today at functions and methods. So let's get right into it. Now you'll see that I've deleted all the code from the last episode and I recommend that you do the same as well, to be honest. So let's just go right from scratch today. Now the first thing you want to do, just like we did last time, is say class program. Just like we did last time. Again, I don't expect you to know what a class is at the minute, but I'm going to do a video all about classes. They're just a bit of a complicated topic. Now, to create our first function, all we do is write void, and that basically means that our function isn't going to return anything, and we'll talk about functions actually returning things later in this video. Now, next we want to type our name of our function, so I'm just going to say test function. And you'll see that unlike variables, the first word starts with an uppercase character. If it was a variable, then we'd say void test function with a small case character. Of course, you don't actually have to follow these conventions for it to work. It will still work if you don't. However, if you're actually doing this professionally, people are going to get annoyed if you're not following these conventions, because then the code will look messy. Now, to tell the computer that this is a function, we straight away have to create a pair of brackets. And you'll see that I just typed one and it automatically typed the second one for me. And then, instead of ending this line with a semicolon like we always had to do with variables, we're actually going to instead create a curly bracket, and you'll see it obviously create the second one for me. That's fine, and we'll press enter. So the reason we didn't have to end that line with a semicolon is because this isn't actually an instruction. It's not telling the computer do this. Like when we were creating variables, it was telling the computer create a variable. But in this case, it's just defining this function so that we can do instructions inside these curly brackets, and that's exactly what this is for. So anything inside these curly brackets will run when the function is called. So let's write some instructions inside these curly brackets. We can start by just creating a new variable. So we'll say, I don't know, we could, just like how we created variables last time, we could just say string test equals, and then obviously because it's a string we need to do this inside speech marks. So I don't know, test, and it's equal to hello. And because it is an instruction this time, we're creating a variable, we do need to end the line with a semicolon. Or we could even then change the value of the variable after this. So if you're changing the value of a variable that's already been created, you don't actually have to write the type of the variable again. You just write the name and then write it equal to something else. So I'll say this time it's equal to hi instead. And of course end the line with a semicolon because we're instructing the computer to change the value. Of course that makes no sense because straight away after we've created it and set it to that, we'll set it to this instead. But if you really want to do that, you can do that, I guess. Now, so this function we've got, it creates that variable, but it's not called anywhere. So to call functions, we can't just call them out in the open anywhere. We've got to call it in a special function called the main function, which is called automatically straight away when the program runs. So, if you want to do that, first write the word static. Now, I don't expect you to know what static means. It's one of the most complicated topics I'm going to teach you, but if we don't type it, it just won't work. So I'm sorry, because I hate saying that you just have to copy it and you don't understand it. And I would try and find a way to not do that, but there is no way we can avoid that, really. Unless I told you about staticism in the first episode, which would be crazy. Anyway, let's type void just like we did below and main. And it has to be exactly spelt like that to tell the computer that it is our special main function. Then just create our pair of brackets. Ignore that it gave us a little suggestion of something to write there. Don't just ignore that. And then again, curly brackets. And then if we want to call our function, we just type the name of our function, so test function. It's given us all these suggestions, again, just ignore it. And then just a pair of brackets, as per usual. And then, because it's an instruction to call that function, end the line with a semicolon. Now this red squiggly line means that we've got an error. That's just because we also need to put static before that function. Again, same thing, don't expect you to understand that. So there we are. Now, if we press run on our code, it's going to call this function, which is then going to create a variable called test and say it equal to hello and then hi. And you can run the program by pressing this green arrow and then the name of your project there. And you'll see that when you run the function, you just get this window called the console. And at the minute, there's nothing on here. We're going to change that really soon. So for now, you can just close this window. And I'm actually going to get rid of this test function now. So get rid of it there, and then we don't need to call it. But do keep your main function. Now we're going to create a function that's slightly more useful now. So again, we can just say static, ignore that word, then void, just like how we did here with our void main. And we can create a function that adds two variables. So we're going to create a function called add. Now in this case, we're actually going to do something inside these brackets. So inside these brackets, we can add what are called arguments, where the function basically takes in variables to then do something with those variables. So let me show you what I mean. So in here, we can say int a, and that's basically taken in, and that basically means it's going to take an integer variable called a, and we don't want to set it equal to anything or anything like that, like we usually would. And we also don't want to create a semicolon. Instead, we'll just create a comma, and then we can define more variables that we want to take in. So I'll say int b, and that's fine. And then again, just as per usual, your semicolons. And now inside this function, we've got an integer called a and an integer called b that we can work with. Now you might be like, well, why can't we just create those integers down here? But that's because it means that when we call this function, so we can say add, now it's telling us that we need to give it an integer a and an integer b. So we can say 5 and 10, and then a semicolon. So now it's going to, when we call this add addition function from here, it's going to give us the numbers 5 and 10. But we could then change these numbers, and it would still work just fine. And this function doesn't even know that the numbers were changed. And we could call it again with completely different numbers, and it would still work. So it's really good, because otherwise we'd have to create a different function for all different numbers, which would be awful. Now I'm just going to keep the first addition method. And inside here we can then add these numbers. So I'm going to create a new integer inside here called sum, and say equal to a plus b. So you can see there that we can actually do maths inside C# with integers and floats. It doesn't work with, obviously you can't add a boolean to a boolean. That wouldn't work, because how do you add false to false? You can't have double false, really, can you? But of course you can add numbers. And we can also change these both to floats, and change this to floats here, and you'll see it still works. But now we can add like 7.6, and remember that f for our float, and 12 point some big number, and it's going to add those really specific decimal numbers. So that's brilliant. You'll also see that if one of them was an integer and one was a float, it would still work down here. Obviously that means that that has to be a 7, it can't be a float like we were passing in before. But there you have it. Now I'm just going to keep these both as floats, and up here we'll change that back to a floating point number that we're taking in. And now, if we run our code, it will add those numbers and put them into the sum variable. But you probably want to be able to see that it's actually done that, and you want to be able to see the result. So to do that, there's a really handy function that means we can actually write information to that console window that we saw earlier. So first, we just want to type console dot, and that's basically accessing this console, which is basically a container of loads of different functions. And you'll see here it's given us a window, and these are all the available functions and variables that are inside this console, this metaphorical console sort of container which has all of these things in. So you'll see here we have one that's called console.writeLine. So I'm going to type that, console.writeLine. And then we're going to write our sum. So we're just calling a function just as we always would do, like we did up here, but it's coming from that console object. And you'll see if we get rid of that console dot, it's like, what? It's giving us an error because it can't. In fact, there's no writeLine function in this sort of program container that we've got here. We've got to specify that is coming from our console container. And you'll also see, so you'll see that this console.writeLine is taking in this floating point value. It's taking in this float value, which is our sum, but it actually takes in any object, so we can give it anything. We can give it the number 5, we can give it that massive whatever that is, and it's going to print that. We can also give it a string, and it would print that. So usually people would say hello world, but for now we're just going to print our value of sum. So now if you save that, make sure you always save your code before running. So press Ctrl and S to save, and then press on our run button. And look at that, at the top of our console we've got a value which should be the added value of the two numbers that you passed into the function here. So you can put in any values. Maybe we say instead this time we want that and that. If rem to save with Ctrl S and run that again, press the run button again, and you'll see we get a different number now. And of course we could change this, so instead of saying console.writeLine sum, we could say hello world. Because it's a string, make sure to remember those speech marks. But if you save again and run, then you'll see we get hello world printed in our console. That's brilliant. But I'm just going to keep this as console.writeLine sum. Now, one extra thing I want you to note is this float sum, is how we can access this float sum. So obviously we accessed our sum variable in here because we've basically taken this variable and written it, so we've put it into this function. But if I was wanting to use this sum variable here, I don't know what that was, so if I said sum equals 5 there, it's giving us an error. It doesn't know what sum is, and that's because this variable sum only exists inside this function. And that's what these curly brackets actually mean. So if it's in curly brackets, then this variable only exists inside these curly brackets. And once it finishes running this function and leaves these curly brackets, or what we call the scope of this function, then that variable is automatically deleted. And that's why we can't just get the sum here and say it equals something. So what if we did want to get the sum over here? Well, we can actually get this addition function to return a value or return the sum. So we can do that by changing where it says void here on our addition function, and instead we can get it to instead of returning nothing or a void, we can get it to return a float. Now I'm just going to delete this console.writeLine. But now it's saying add, and it's saying not all code paths return a value. And that's basically saying that we've created this sum variable, but it doesn't know that it's our sum variable that we want to actually return from our function. And to make sure it knows that, just like it's suggesting here, we'd literally just write return sum and then a semicolon. So there's no brackets involved or anything. You literally just write in return sum. The way that this works, the way that we can then get this sum over here, is that we can then create a variable. We can create our sum variable up here, and we can say equal to this function. So it might seem a bit weird, we're setting a float equal to a function, but we're actually not. We're setting it equal to the value that this function is returning. So we're going to give it these two numbers here. That's sort of the template that we're giving it. It's going to take those two numbers, A and B, and then return sum. So then the value of that is going to be the sum. And then we're just going to we're setting our new sum variable, or we can call this anything, test, equal to that. And then to check that this still works, we can then say console.writeLine test up here instead. And you'll see that it should still give us the value of those two variables added together. So I'm going to run our project again. And there you go, it still gives us that value. So now I'm just going to recap what all this code does. So we have our special main function, which is automatically called right when we press our run button. Now here we create a variable called test, and we're setting it equal to the result of this addition function. So how that works is that we're saying that our addition function is required to take in two floats or two variables. One's called A and one's called B. So we've given that there. We've said that A is going to be equal to 384 and B is going to be equal to 23, for example, but it obviously can be anything. And then we've created a new variable here called sum, and say equal to A plus B, our two variables, and we're returning sum. And the reason we can do that is because we've said that this function returns a float instead of nothing or a void. And then, since it's done all that, this is plugged into here because we're saying that is equal to that. And then we're just writing the value of this variable that we've just got to the console. So you'll see that it is actually very algebraic or mathematical. Functions really are very similar to doing algebra. Now, just to show you that we can add any value to these and it works, I'm going to copy and paste this code we've got here. So I'm just going to do Control-C to copy like you would anywhere. Go, and you'll see I've created a lines gap just to make it more obvious. You'll see we can't call this new floating point number test because we've already got that variable inside the scope. So I'm going to call this one new test or something. Remember our naming convention. And that's going to be equal to adding two different numbers. Maybe let's do a decimal one now. And remember to put your F on the end to show that it's a float. And then some different numbers here. And then we need to make sure that we're writing new test here instead of just test, otherwise it's just going to take in this value both times. Remember to save, Control plus S to do that. And now if you run our code, you should see that we have two numbers. One is the result of adding those two, and one is the result of adding those two. And there you are. That is literally everything you'll ever need to know about functions in C#. The next video is going to be about if statements, and I hope to see you then. Goodbye.